Right. So Haney and John gave you very nice and broad pictures of human genetic diversity across the world. I'll be focusing on the kind of stories we can tell nowadays about single populations because we now have enough individuals with genomic data available within populations that we can start picking apart some fine-scale patterns of genomic diversity. So this is work led by postdoc Sohail Baharian in my lab. So this particular work is on African Americans. So my primary reason for studying African Americans is that it's a large, important human group. There are over 40 million individuals who self-identify as African Americans. And it's just important to understand what made up the genetic diversity in that population. As both John and Sohail mentioned, this population has been traditionally underserved by biomedical research. And here, underserved is an understatement, but I couldn't find any word that was appropriate for use in a video conference talk. There are many reasons why this happened. There's racism, obviously. But there are also other reasons. So once people observed in this 2009 paper that vast majority of genomic studies focus on Europeans only, there was a big movement in the field where people thought this is not right. Funding agencies jumped in and said, okay, well, now researchers need to include more diverse populations. It's very important, and people have started doing that because the funding agencies required it. However, in many studies where, of which I'm a part, I see people sample individuals across, say, across the world or across different ethnic groups, and when it comes time to do the analysis, they say, okay, well, we have the Europeans here, we know what to do with them, and the other guys, well, we'll put them aside and we'll deal with them later because it's complicated, right? So there's this perverse effect, this vicious circle where when you know a population better, we have better models for it, it's easier to study it, and so people study it more. And so there's just a statistical limitation that makes people with good intentions eventually foster a racist system, essentially. So that's one of the reasons that we're trying to do this, try to build better models for these populations and understand what's going on to make general research easier. African Americans had a particularly dramatic recent history, and including recent demographic history, with multiple large-scale migrations across the world. Some migrations coerced and some migrations intentional. And this left all kinds of signatures in the genomes. There's also a history of admixture of African Americans with both European Americans and Native Americans. And as Sohail mentioned, and also John, this left these signatures of statistical signatures in the genome that we need to take into account if we want to understand genetic diversity. So in the first day when we talked about climate change, we heard that the trade was actually a very good source of reliable records because trade is very important. So the ships that went to the Americas to collect gold, we have very good records of those and their wreckages because this was considered a very important industry. There's another industry that was also considered very important and very lucrative, and of course is very important for African American history, and that's the transatlantic slave trade. And actually, because we have very good records, which are compiled on the Slave Voyages website, people have generated these nice animations where we can see each boat as an individual dot. And we have, if you go on the website and you can click on the dot, and each dot represents dozens to hundreds of individuals who are forcibly brought to the Americas. Okay. And you can see there's all these interesting patterns that your eye can pick up. One of them is that obviously slavery and slave trade was a general, an industry that all colonial powers used, and individuals were brought into all parts of the Americas. The United States was an enthusiastic but not one of the largest players in the sense that more individuals were brought into the Caribbean and into Brazil compared to the United States. Things really picked up in the 1700s, and you can see all the different patterns of connections between the countries that colonial powers controlled on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, the United States was one of the first countries to ban international slave trade in 1808. And so you can see that as we get closer to 1808, there's going to be one last burst of trade, and then things stopped. Okay, so that was because international trade was controlled by the North, which was mostly anti-slavery. But the United States continued to run slavery within the United States until the end of the Civil War in roughly 1865. So the US was one of the first countries to ban international slave trade and one of the last countries to ban slavery. And one of the consequences of this was that in the US there was much more natural population growth among the enslaved population. Okay, so if I break down this slave trade by regions within the US, so here I broke down the arrival place of enslaved individuals across the coast here. So you have the north here in green, the Chesapeake Bay area. So this is near Washington, D.C. It's right at the border between the traditional north and south in the US. You have the south here, the Carolinas and Georgia, and you have the Gulf states. And one thing you can see is that, well, firstly, there's approximately 400,000 individuals who were brought in and who survived the voyage. The vast majority of individuals were brought in the south or near the south. And because of changes in the economy, these people were then forced to march inland towards the plantations, which were also predominantly in the south. Okay? So these here are cumulative graphs of arrivals. I should say there's this one interesting feature here, that international slave trade was abolished in 1808. You can see that in the Gulf states, there's still more arrivals of enslaved people. So what happened then is that, we can go and look at the actual ships that arrived. And so these were Spanish ships that were captured by the US Navy, who said, well, I mean, there was war. Also, international slave trade was illegal, so the merchandise, humans, were seized as merchandise. But because slavery was still allowed, these individuals were still sold into slavery, right? There was kind of a loophole that people used a little bit, but this was stopped a little bit later. So the arrival of new individuals was largely stopped from Africa, decreased dramatically until much more recently in history, where we have, of course, much more migration, intercontinental migration. Okay, so if we look at the entire population, so the count of individuals who are identified as African Americans over time, you can see that here, this is the curve of the population in the south of the US. You have the Northeast, the Midwest, and the west of the US. And you can see that until 1910, roughly, well, first of all, the vast, vast majority of the population is concentrated in the south of the US. Okay? You can also see that there's this essentially exponential growth of the population through the ban on international slave trade and the ban on slavery, right? So both during slavery and after slavery, people have children, population grows naturally. You can see that this continues until 1910. In 1910, there's this abrupt kink. It's very significant. And so growth stops essentially in the south and really picks up in the north and the Midwest. And so this is what defines the beginning of the Great Migration, during which millions of African Americans left the south towards the north in search of less horrible economic and social conditions. Okay? And so this was caused by many different historical events. Some of them were agricultural, with the cotton plantations not working well because of pests, the boll weevil. There were also the wars that triggered northern industries to come and try to recruit African American workers, and all these different factors contributed to a really, really massive exodus, right? And you can see that the population here in the north and Midwest grew from less than 1 million to 3 million actually 4 million in each over a very short period of time. Okay, so now we try to do genetics, and we try to take genetic data and reconstruct the history. Usually we go backwards in time, so we start with genomes of individuals that live in 2016. And then we try to reconstruct what happened to them. And when we do this, the first thing we have to do is to look at the most recent events. We need to understand the most recent thing, go through that, and then if we want to go and understand things like the transatlantic slave trade, we first need to resolve what happened during the Great Migration and how this affected genetic diversity. And so that's what I'm going to focus on today. So this particular period, this very recent period, 1910 to 1970. Okay, so this is an artistic rendering by Jacob Lawrence of the Great Migration. I saw that at the beginning of the project. And so this shows a train station, presumably, and a group of African Americans trying to leave the South and engulfing into these different doors in a way that looks essentially almost like almost random in a sense. Because in many cases, individuals who left the South didn't have very much power and people actively tried to prevent them from leaving the South because they were used as labor and not quite slavery, but indentured labor in many cases. So people left as they could, and so they took whichever means of transportation was available in many cases, or the most affordable ones in other cases. And so one of the goals of this project was to figure out what routes people took and how this affected patterns of genomic diversity across the population. So the data that we have to look at this so we have 3 different cohorts that we used. And today I'll focus on one of them, which is the health and retirement study. So this is a longitudinal study where people recruited across the United States. And this was particularly unique in that they took very good care of being representative in the sampling. So in many cohorts that we have that have been assembled for medical purposes, people are recruited at clinics and based on their disease status. So it's very hard to make inferences about population movements. But this particular cohort sampled about 10,000 individuals, including 1,500 African Americans, about 9,000 European Americans, and distributed across the entire United States, and with care to represent both urban and rural regions and different strata of socioeconomic status. We also have looked at the Southern Community Cohort Study, which had 2,000 African Americans, primarily in the South and in rural locations. And this was done to compensate the fact that these had been previously understudied, essentially. So we have one study here that tries to be representative overall, and one study here that tries to compensate previous underrepresentation. And both these studies use genotyping, as John explained, which is a measure where they measure the genomes of each individual at 1 million to 2.5 million different locations in the genome. Okay, so the first thing that I did as a population geneticist, I had seen John November's paper showing the map of Europe, and I thought, okay, well, we'll do a PCA, and we'll hope to see general patterns in the population, and maybe we're going to see a map of the United States, and it's going to be amazing. We don't see that, and simply because people have arrived in the US more recently, and there hasn't been enough time for people to thoroughly form a uniform randomly mating population, I suppose. So what we see here is that the principal axis of variation here, this component 1, primarily distinguishes between the European Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans, and Asians, and the African populations. And the African American populations here. The second axis here represents the diversity largely between Europe and Africa, and Asia and the Americas. And you can see that individuals from the cohorts form these kinds of clouds. And again, John had alluded to what causes this kind of variation is that individuals from African American identity tend to have ancestry from both Europe, Africa, and the Americas, right? So you have individuals who are at the bottom here who tend to have essentially all African ancestry. Some individuals here have predominantly European ancestry, and there are some individuals like these guys here who essentially fall with the very similar ancestral makeup as Hispanic populations. We can formalize this in different ways. So this is very similar to what John presented. If I have one particular individual, just as a reminder, this individual here has 4 different ancestors, which I arbitrarily painted in blue for African and red for European, over time, recombination breaks down these segments in shorter and shorter bits. And if you look at one individual and you look at all their 22 chromosomes, it looks something like this, right? So this particular individual, we inferred ancestry along their genome, and we found that this particular individual had about 80% African ancestry once you sum up the ancestry across the whole genome. So 80% ancestry from Africa and about 20% from Europe, and traces from the Americas. And that tells us a bit about the ancestors of this individual, right? We can use that. We can sum all these, figure out like roughly this person had roughly 80% African ancestors, 20% European ancestors, and maybe 1% native ancestors if you went back 600 years. Okay, so we do this for every individual in the cohort, and so now every individual is represented as a vertical line with African ancestry here represented in blue, European in red, and native in yellow. And you can see that in this cohort, there's a lot of variation in the proportion of ancestry, with some individuals here having, again, 100% African ancestry, and one individual here in particular showing 0% inferred African ancestry. Okay? And this is a moment where I always stop and emphasize that these are all African Americans, right? Being African American is a question of identity. Genetics is not answering the question of who is in what group. There's always, every once in a while, there are situations that pop up in the media where individuals who claim to be African Americans turned out not to have known African American ancestors, and then there's all these scandals over what does that mean? How can this person say they're African American? So this is all a social debate, social construction about who says that who is African American. That's not a debate that I'm, want to be a part of based on genetic data, right? So what this tells us is not who's African American, it's just where your ancestors most likely lived 600 years ago. Okay, so if we break things down by region, the most striking pattern we found was that individuals in the south of the US, African Americans in the south of the US, had a higher proportion of African ancestry compared to the north and the west of the US. It's not a massive difference, but it's very significant. And okay, so that's interesting. And when I started thinking about this, I thought, okay, this is not necessarily surprising. And when I show this to people typically think, yes, this is rather expected. But people expect this for different kinds of reasons. And most of them are not correct. So the first thing that people usually come up with is the enlightened north hypothesis, right? Where there was more segregation in the south of the US, whereas in the north, people were more welcoming or whatnot, and so there was more admixture in the north because African Americans intermarried freely with European Americans, or more freely, and this led to more admixture occurring in the north. I guess as my language has suggested, this hypothesis does not really hold water for reasons that we'll see in a second. Another reason that's often proposed is that the African American population is larger in the South. There's just a higher proportion of African Americans, and so just if people more or less randomly choose their partners, as the model that John presented suggests, or if that's a reasonable model, you'd expect African Americans to more often marry African Americans in the South, and therefore less often in the North, and therefore more admixture in the North. Also doesn't really, will not work really. And the third explanation, I guess I will withhold for now, and I guess you can think about it, and we'll discover it as we go along. Okay, so we can do this. So this was a proportion of African ancestry. We can do the same thing for European ancestry, but as we'd expect, most African Americans have mostly African and European ancestry, and therefore these are kind of mirror images of each other, so we don't learn that much that's new. If you look at Native American ancestry, we can find a bit more interesting patterns. We find more Native ancestry in the West and in the Southwest. And this is consistent with historical records that there were more Native Americans alive in these regions when slavery when African slavery was brought in, because there were also Native American slaves in the early days of slavery. There's also this weird, massive increase of Native ancestry in the Northeast. This one turns out to be because a single individual had 70% Native ancestry in that region, and that really bumped up the proportion. It's actually not significant once you permute over the set of individuals. in the population. We can also break this down like by state, and there's all these interesting stories, like Louisiana is a crazy outlier for everything, but I'm not going to get into that right now. So what we're going to try to get into now is in more detail. So now we looked at the proportion of ancestry. We're going to try to look now at the timing of ancestry. Can we look at the length of these segments of ancestry and figure out when did this admixture occur? And so we developed a method to do that. And the way it works is pretty straightforward. We're just going to build a histogram. So this is just kind of a repeat of John's slides, I guess. I just wanted to emphasize that over time, going from one generation to the next, these segments get shorter and shorter, right? And so we want to use this and build a model for what happens here. So what we're going to do, again, is that we're going to build a histogram. We're just going to count, for example, for the native segments in yellow, we're going to count the number of very long segments. And here, there's no very long segments in orange. There's the longish segments, and here I found 1 and 2. There's a shortish segments, and maybe there's 6, and so on. I just build a histogram. I just count the number of short and long segments, and I do this across all individuals, and I do this across all populations. And so this is the data here. So that all the dots represent the data summed over all individuals in the population. So the blue is the blue dots represent the histogram of the length of the segments, the length of the African segments. The lengths are measured in centimorgan, which is a particular measure of how far, how long things are along the genome. And the solid lines are the best fit model. So the model had some free parameters. We could adjust when did migrations occurred and how much migration occurred at each generation. And we fitted these parameters to reproduce the data as well as possible. And so this is essentially as good a fit as you can get in a biological system. And the best fit model is shown here. So I'll walk you through it because it's a little bit confusing. So time goes from left to the present here. So this is the past, this is the present. So the population is assumed to live inside this black arrow. And these colored arrows represent migrants arriving into the population. And so 18 generations ago, here in this model, we have the arrival, so a founding of the population with predominantly African individuals and a few Native American migrants. And the European migration, what we found is that the best model predicted 2 pulses of migration, 2 waves of migration, one 8 generations ago and one 4 generations ago. It's actually very hard to distinguish between 2 or multiple pulses and continuous migration. So actually, I'm not saying that there were 2 distinct pulses. There's been more than one, essentially. But in all the models that we tried, there was no evidence for very much recent admixture, and very little less than 4 generations ago. Also a moment where I always try to remember, it's important to realize that these individuals were sampled for a retirement study, so most of them were born prior to 1960. If we did the exact same experiment with young people born after 1960, the results would look different because the rate of intermarriage across groups has increased dramatically since 1960. So this is all pre-1960. So, okay, so this is what we see. So in terms of years, if you want to convert these generation times in terms of years, human generation time, roughly 20, so here we use 26 years per generation. And so if we convert these, we get 1506 for the foundation of the population and 1754 to 1868, which are right at the boundaries of when the bulk of slavery was happening. So that's consistent, of course, with the known historical fact that a lot of admixture occurred through rape on plantations by slave owners. And we cannot verify, we can verify this subsequently by comparing X chromosomes and Y chromosomes that are transmitted along differently by sex. And we find that evidence that, of course, the European contributors were mostly males. We also find that the native contributors were mostly female. And I'm not going to have the time to go into much detail about the native admixture in this talk. But again, the important thing here is that most of this admixture did not occur in the 20th century, right? It occurred during slavery. And so, okay, so we have this general picture. So we have, we find this fine scale variation in ancestry proportion. African ancestry is elevated in the south. But admixture occurred primarily during slavery. And these estimates, we can take individuals from the north of the US or from the south or from any region in the US, and we estimate the timing of admixture, and it always occurs prior to the Civil War, right? And so what it suggests is that remember at that time, most African Americans lived in the South, right? So the admixture, the excess admixture that we see in the North, the excess European ancestry, okay, this all occurred before the Great Migration. And what that tells us is that it's people who left the South for the North who had greater European ancestry proportion, right? It's not the enlightened North. It's just that people who had more European ancestry had better access to resources. And there's many different reasons why these people might have had an easier time to migrate north. Essentially, with the first people who left the South had the most European ancestry, and the subsequent waves of migrants had more African ancestry. And actually, so this was the hypothesis that we generated from the genetic data. We actually realized that we could verify this directly because we know in individuals in the cohort where they were born and where they currently live, and these people were born during the Great Migration. And so the plots I showed you earlier was looking at individuals sorted according to where they currently live. And this is the proportion of African ancestry in the south, north, and west of the US. If instead I showed you the proportion of African ancestry based on where people were born, the picture would look somewhat different. And you'd see much more difference across regions. People who were born in the West, for example, had a much reduced proportion of African ancestry. Okay, and there's this, so we want to show that this has to do with this biased migration, or this ancestry-biased migration. And so we can further separate people according to whether they were migrants or immigrants, emigrants or immigrants in different regions. And what we see is that individuals here who left the South in purple, compared to individuals who remained in the South, had a lower African ancestry proportion. So when these people left, the net result in the South was an increase in African ancestry proportion. Now, when these people arrived to the North and West, they also had a higher proportion of African ancestry than people who currently live there. And so the net result of this was that the proportion of African ancestry in the North and West also increased as the result of this migration. So if you go back to this figure, when my postdoc showed this to me, I thought he had a bug in his code because it's impossible for the proportion of African ancestry to increase over time in the same set of individuals, but this is just the net result of individuals flowing from the South to the North and West. But it really validates this model of a first wave of individuals, more privileged, had more European ancestry, second wave of migration closer to 1970, continued to have this ancestry-biased migration, but a little bit less so than the first wave of migration. Okay, and finally, we wanted to go a bit deeper into the specific routes that people use to travel from the south to the north. And this is a place where we did a lot of reading and lots of talking with historians about how did people travel. And as I said in the beginning, individuals didn't always have lots of resources and took whichever means of transportations were available to them. I reordered my slides. I'll just go back here. So these here are the transit routes that have been well documented. For example, individuals who lived in Florida and in the East Coast tended to take the Eastern Seaboard train up to the northern states. Individuals who lived further inland tended to go to the Midwest and the Great Lakes area. Okay, and a bit later, people started going to California. Okay, so this is the picture that we got from history books. So going back here to this slide that John presented earlier, what we're going to be looking at here is we're going to take pairs of individuals in our sample, and we're just going to try to identify recent relatedness between these individuals. And we detect this relatedness by finding long stretches of the genome that are shared between these individuals, right? And so, for example, these two individuals here share a common grandparent, and as a result, they have this long shared segment along their genome, and we can statistically identify those. And if I can plot, the amount of relatedness, the average amount of relatedness between pairs of individuals across regions, it looks like this. So here, each line here represents the average pairwise relatedness, in this case between the southeast and the northeast, and the width of the line represents the amount of relatedness between individuals. And as you can see, this kind of agrees with this figure, right, where the known historical routes that people used show up as thicker lines on this figure. Now there's a big caveat here, is that this is an image that I drew in PowerPoint. And I could very well have drawn it after having essentially generated this data, because historical data is very complex and confusing, and actually I think that I might have. So just to make sure that we didn't fool ourselves and post hoc explain our result, we went and collected census data and demographic data about the migrations that were known. And we generated a genetic model that incorporated the census data and tried to predict how much relatedness we'd expect between each different region. And this is the model that we got. And okay, so we have very, very good agreement here between the two, between the predicted and the observed data. And we find that these south to north patterns that follow these train tracks and these bus routes really are reflected in the genetic data. Okay, so if we do the same thing with Europeans, we get a very different picture. So here I'm going to replace the theoretical model, the predicted model for African Americans by the data for European Americans. And you see that among European Americans, we don't have this north to south pattern because there was no great migration among European Americans. Among European Americans, you primarily see the relatedness within the south. Okay, so this is quite different. So what does that mean, and where does that leave us? I mean, the first most important thing from my perspective is that we have this very detailed quantitative model of genomic diversity in the population. We understand what's going on. We understand the diversity patterns in these genomes. This confirms many aspects of historical narrative that we already knew. Like if we go to historians and tell them, oh, there's been lots of admixture in the South during slavery, they're going to be not surprised. But we confirm this from a different perspective. And as Sohini pointed out, this is useful. But there's also lots of things that we can actually measure that are not really possible to measure from historical data. For example, the ancestry-biased in migration is not easy to measure. Even if you have genealogical data, for many individuals, this is largely incomplete and biased, even though that can also tell us a lot of information. So we have all these interesting things that we can go back and forth and discuss with historians. But maybe the most important thing for us is to discuss this with geneticists, because if historians knew about the Great Migration, I mean, the great majority of geneticists don't know about these historical processes, at least non-African American geneticists. And so one of the things that John mentioned is that it's important when we do these association studies and these medical studies to account for population structure and to build into your model something that accounts for this spatial and differentiation between different groups. And it turns out that if we looked at the distribution of the population based on the proportion of ancestry, we're going to get this impression that, oh yes, okay, African Americans in the North and West are kind of similar to each other based on ancestry proportion, which is the kind of correction factor that most people have been using. But actually, if you look at actual relatedness pattern in the population, you get the opposite pattern, where its individuals are more related to each other along these north to south tracks. And so when we one of the things that we're trying to do now is build better models here to model population membership and try to help people identify diseases in the African American population. Of course, the next step as well, now that we've gone back through the Great Migration and understand how they shuffle the genomes and the distribution of genetic diversity, is we want to go back through this international transatlantic slave trade and try to figure out exactly what happened, where did people come from in Africa, and there's lots of interest at the personal genomics level, go to individuals and try to identify where people came from, for example. And that was not possible for us when we started this project because we did not have very much genomic diversity or genomic samples along the coast of Africa, but now this is changing. Lots of people are realizing this is important, and we now have the data and we'll be able to go and try to address these problems. So I'll end with acknowledgements to people in the lab, and thank you very much.